Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Zangetsu unleashed Ichigo's full powers early? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content, and subscribe my channel and like this video. If you like to hear adult version of this and other stories, I'll give you link of my Patreon. Go support and follow the PancakeBatterBTW for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story. Link in the description. Let's start this video. Darkness. Within the endless void that would one day become something great stood a man, dressed in a white dress shirt with a long black overcoat with tattered ends. His shoulder-length ragged dark brown hair slightly eclipsing his brown-tinted sunglasses with a shadowed goatee completing his face. The man stood completely still, patiently awaiting the day his words would be heard, waiting for the slowly approaching day. The void of black around him became something he could both hear and see. The owner of this void in his physical world slowly growing, unable to hear his voice, unable to receive help he desperately wanted to give in times of need. This was one of those times. The man opened his eyes as multiple waves of bright blue light passed through the void around him, his face turning to one of worry and sadness. Straightening his back, the man looked around, searching for anything different. Upon a quick inspection of the void around him, he found nothing had changed. Once again, the power surged, but with much greater strength. With his overcoat and hair blowing and the vast energy flowing through the void, he knew what this meant. Once the surge died down, and his hair returned to his shoulders, for the first time in weeks he opened his mouth. Ichigo, the man's deep voice echoing through the vast void around him. He waited for several moments, defiantly hoping for a response, but when none came, he gave a heavy sigh and closed his eyes again. The realization began setting in that the child he wanted to protect couldn't be spared from his future. He made his choice right then that once the boy could hear his voice, he would not limit him, he would give all his power to him. Every day, the man called and waited for a response. When none came, he went back to waiting. Years passed, and only twice had his voice been heard. The orange-haired boy would search for who had called his name, but in vain, as his father looked on, not wanting this for his son. After those 2 times, the man's voice seemed to only grow further away from the boy. All the man could do was watch on as one day a hollow attacked him and his mother. He could only watch as the boy was overcome by grief and guilt, falling into a depression that would take a great amount of time to get out of. It was at this time that the void around the man changed slightly. Everything was still the same except above him, storm clouds had formed, and with them the rain. The downpour lasted for many months, drenching the only inhabitant of the void. While the forming of the clouds and rain showed that the boy's powers were beginning to manifest, he still couldn't hear him. Time continued to pass with changes. The clouds were still there while the rain had stopped. The bottomless void changed into a large empty meadow with cobblestone pathways outlining square and rectangular patches of grass with a dense forest surrounding the meadow. The man stood in the center of the meadow where all the cobblestone paths led, his hair and overcoat flowing with the breeze as he watched his one day to be wielder grow up. The man could feel it now, the power flowing within this world and leaking into his wielder's physical world. Although he was concerned, as right now his wielder's power was a fraction of what it currently should be. As night came and his wielder was now asleep, the man wanted to try once more on reaching him. Ichigo. The man's deep voice was only loud enough for someone right in front of him to hear, and when no answer was returned, he continued. Ichigo. The voice, louder than before, disappeared as the silence reigned again before it finally happened. Hello? A confused voice came back that the man instantly recognized as his 17-year-old wielder. The spiky orange-haired young man opened his eyes and took a step back as he was assaulted with random colors. Everything in his vision was blurry, random, and twisting, everything except an intimidating middle-aged man standing a couple of meters ahead. Regaining his senses, the teen decided to ask the obvious question. Who are you and where the hell are we? The older man's resting face turned to a large grin. He had been trying to talk to his wielder for years, and now finally he was able to. He took a step forward. I am the final word muttered by the man fell on deaf ears as Ichigo only looked more confused. The man's smile turned into a small frown. I see, currently you are not ready to learn my name. For now, that is all right, as you can now hear me. As for where we are, he paused, this is where I live. The grin on his face returned and then quickly disappeared as he felt someone else's presence nearby. Ichigo's mind was working overtime as he tried and failed to process the little information given to him by the man in the cloak. Too many things were going through his brain. He was sleeping, but this was not a dream. The only thing he could see clearly was the man in front of him, and that for some reason he was not ready to hear his name. What does that mean, not ready for what? You will find out in time. No need to worry about it in the present. As for right now, it seems that you have a visitor. The blurriness vision Ichigo was now started to get accustomed to faded along with the man in front of him. Back into his view was the ceiling of his room. The curtain of the slightly opened window above his bed, dancing in a light breeze, creating small shadows on the walls from the moonlight. As Ichigo turned facing the wall, he noticed one barely moving shadow that was much larger than the rest but still relatively short. Not recalling anything in his room that could have caused it, he raised his head and followed the path of the shadow and noticed something odd. A short woman with raven-colored hair and violet eyes, wearing a black shihakusho with sandals and a sheathed katana on her left side. You have a visitor. The man's words rang in his ears, confirming that what just happened was real and not a trick. Ichigo observed the woman look around his room, clearly searching for something. Slowly sitting up, his eyes became drawn to the sheathed blade at her side, the red hilt with a diamond pattern partially visible in the soft moonlight. Thinking of what to do, the idea of moving to intercept the intruder quickly dissipated from his mind, as he'd prefer not to be skewered by her blade. His thought process and breathing completely stopped as the woman, who was now shrouded in the only dark corner of his room, turned and looked directly at him, her violet eyes meeting his amber and refusing to move. Damn! Ichigo mentally cursed. His eyes darted, avoiding eye contact while trying his hardest to keep a straight face. One wrong movement would alert her to his ability to see her. So, when she found it, her hand instinctively trailed the hilt of her katana. "Can you see me?" she asked, fully prepared to unsheath her blade. Understanding that there would be no hiding it now, his eyes met hers again. Her eyes widened slightly as she finally realized that not only could he see her, but she wasn't able to sense and Ryatsu from him. She had been in Karakura town for only a couple of weeks and had already seen multiple people that had a high amount of Ryatsu for humans. Everyone knew that Karakura town was a very spiritually active place. There had even been rumors that a group of exiles was here, and she personally had found a poorly dressed shopkeeper that not only could see her but helped her out. The humans in Karakura town also had more Ryatsu than normal. Some high enough that they could be able to see plus souls. Every human in this town had at least a little Ryatsu, most not enough to see spirits, let alone a soul reaper like her. Despite all this, absolutely zero Ryatsu was coming from him. The entire reason she was here was because while she was patrolling, she felt someone's Ryatsu skyrocket. Then on her way to see what it was, the pressure fell to an undetectable level, which left her to search for who could have caused it. Neither of them made a move. They just stared at each other. "What's your name?" she finally asked, her eyes squinting like she thought there was something familiar about the person in front of her. "You broke into my room." "Your name first." Ichigo scoffed. After a few seconds in a conflicting mental battle, she responded, "Rukia Kachiki." Her hand still on the hilt of her katana as her eyes continuously scanned him. Ichigo slowly rolled out of his bed, maintaining eye contact with the onage Rukia as he did. Now standing and out of the shadows, he noticed how short Rukia was. Meanwhile, Rukia was frozen in place. Looking at the standing man in front of her, she couldn't help but see her mentor. Everything was the same down to the bone structure of his face. The only difference was the orange hair and a scowl so deep it must have been surgically implanted. The shocked Rukia stumbled in place, her hand leaving the katana. "Ichigo Kurosaki," he replied. "Now what exactly are you?" Ichigo asked, failing to find the right words for such a question. Rukia shoved her previous thoughts to the back of her mind, then regained her composure. She didn't know what to say. To tell him that she was a soul reaper would only bring many more questions, but at the same time to not tell him anything would only confuse him to no end. She could go and get something to erase his memory, then make a report. That might work. I just have to find that weird shopkeeper again, she thought. With her mind now made up, she moved towards the window, ready to outright ignore him. Ichigo quickly moved to block her. He needed answers to all the questions that had been accumulating in the back of his mind. Once he was in the way of the escaping intruder, he reached out to grab her from going around him, clearly unaware of who he was dealing with. Rukia wasn't one to be trapped like this and leaped from the ground. Her feet found Ichigo's outstretched arm and used it as a springboard. Hopping over and kicking him in the back of the head, Ichigo, dumbfounded at what had just happened, turned around to retaliate. Mid he was cut off by a beeping sound. Rukia calmly raised her hand to stop Ichigo from moving forward anymore, with her other hand pulling out her beeping phone looking Denrya Shinki. Surprise overtook her as a blinking red dot showed a hollow right outside the house that she was currently in. Something was off, she just didn't have time to think about it. Stay here, she instructed, opening the window further than leaping out before he could get in a word. Rukia quickly moved to the front of the house where she found a hollow looking through what was once a wall. The hollow sniffed the air looking for the owner of the previous burst of Ryatsu when he caught the smell of something just as good. A soul reaper. The hollow turned from the hole in the wall and moved to attack Rukia. In turn, she unsheathed her Zanpakuto and dashed forward in hope to end the fight before it could truly begin. Unfortunately for her, this hollow was not as weak as the others she had dealt with thus far in her mission. The hollow quickly blocked her attack, then went to grab her. She flash-stepped away before any harm could come to her. Heido number 63 Raikoho. An orb of lightning quickly appeared in the palm of her hand and shot forward, towards the hollow. Shock overcame her as the seemingly low-leveled hollow simply smacked the blast downwards, causing a slight crack in the pavement. With no other options, Rukia, for the first time in this mission, released her Zanpakuto. Dance Sodi no Shiryuki. Her blade turned white as she started forward. Preparing to use her greater power to defeat the hollow in front of her, she was forced to stop as a burning sensation overtook her neck. Her Zanpakuto reverting to its sealed state. Rukia held her hand tightly to her burning neck as she dodged a swing from the hollow. She may not have known what was happening but could tell what caused it. All high-class soul reapers who went to the world of the living were forced to wear seals. These seals would limit the power of the soul reaper to only 1/5 of their normal power so as to not affect humans. But what she couldn't understand was why she had one. She couldn't even recall it ever being placed. What made this even more unusual was that her power was not limited. When a seal is placed on a soul reaper, that person could feel their power being limited. But she still had all her power. It was just that now she couldn't unseal her Zanpakuto and reach it. Now left without the ability to unseal her Zanpakuto and the burning that was rapidly expanding from her neck downward, she could only hope the hollow made a mistake that she could take advantage of. Upstairs, Ichigo was going to listen to the weird katana-wielding midget. He really was. He was perfectly content with sticking to his own business like he had done for years while the midget was conducting things that were clearly out of his league. Unfortunately for him, this contentment was shattered when he heard a large roar and small yelp of pain coming from the only other person around, Rukia. Moving his way downstairs and out of the hole in the wall, he was unprepared for the sight he came across. Standing in the middle of the road was a large gray and black, relatively humanoid-looking creature with a hole in its abdomen and a white mask covering its head. But what stuck out the most wasn't its appearance but who it was holding, the clearly bloodied and exhausted Rukia in its lacerated hand. The hollow was about to finish off Rukia when it suddenly stopped. The hollow turned toward Ichigo and sniffed. This was it. Traces of the delicious Ryatsu were on the team. The hollow dropped Rukia and charged towards Ichigo. As soon as Rukia hit the ground, she used what little strength she had left and flash-stepped toward Ichigo, grabbing his collar, and took off down the street while dragging him behind her. She looked over her shoulder at the hollow slowly giving chase, obviously enjoying its hunt. Her movement bought them a little time before it would reach them. Once she stopped, she let go of the winded Ichigo as he fell to the ground. What the hell was that creature? And what did you just do? He questioned in between breaths. Rukia, struggling to stay on her feet, looked down at her wound. She couldn't fight like this. She knew that some type of seal was still in place and stopping her from being able to release her Zanpakuto. I'm going to stab you with my Zanpakuto. It will give you some of my power so you can defeat this hollow. She calmly stated, although on the inside she was furious at everything. What I can't. Ichigo tried to respond but was cut off. We don't have time for this. Will you do this or not? Rukia's voice made it clear there was no second option. Ichigo could only nod as he tried to figure out what he was more scared of, the hollow that wanted to eat him, or the terrifying midget in front of him. Before Ichigo could so much as stand back up, Rukia had already stabbed him with her Zanpakuto. The blade faded as visible black ryatsu formed around him, creating a shihakusho like the one she was wearing. His stab wound closed as a rush of ryatsu forced her already weakened legs to the ground. The next instant everything stopped as Ichigo's ryatsu started to fade. The kneeling Rukia glanced at Ichigo, who had positioned himself between her and the approaching hollow. In his right hand was a thin, long Zanpakuto, her Zanpakuto. The hollow, sensing a new Shinigami, picked up his pace towards his delicious new meal. Ichigo leaped forward towards the hollow with a killer instinct few had seen. Once close enough, the hollow swiped at Ichigo, who quickly dodged it thanks to his now faster movement speed. He then cut upwards at the out-of-place arm, cutting it off at the elbow before moving again to block the next swipe. He then moved closer into the personal space of the large hollow, cutting off its slender leg at the knee, forcing the hollow to topple onto one knee and, more importantly, closer to the ground. With the height difference minimized, he again cut upwards, slicing the mask into two before the hollow could properly react. The two sides of the mask shattered on impact with the pavement. The rest of its body immediately followed, slowly disappearing and fading away. "Bastard!" Ichigo snarled. Feeling that was enough, he turned around to face the shocked Rukia, who was doing the best to heal herself. "How did you do that?" she asked. "I don't know. Would you believe me if I said it was instinct?" Ichigo responded. "Hey, what's happening to your clothes?" Rukia looked down at her shihakusho as the black began turning white. "No, no, no!" Rukia looked around, her eyes desperately searching for her Zanpakuto. "You took all my power! Idiot!" Rukia furiously stated as she kicked him in the shin before the two began to bicker in the street. Unknown to both Ichigo and Rukia, a certain clog-wearing blonde shopkeeper with a green-striped bucket hat and a spiky black-haired man with a beard that some might say makes him look like a goat had just watched the events play out. "Well, Isshin, it looks like your son has become a soul reaper after all," the joyful shopkeeper exclaimed, flipping open a fan to hide his massive grin as he looked over at his companion. "Shut up, Kasuk," Isshin growled back. He was in no mood to play around, after all his work and favors he had to give out to stop this from happening. Not only was it now happening, but he had to witness it. "Oh, Masaki, our idiot son has taken his first step into a world I promised he wouldn't," Isshin loudly yelled as he opened his wallet and looked at a picture of his late wife. Unbeknownst to Ichigo and Rukia, along with Kasuk and Isshin, the black-cloaked man in Ichigo's inner world was anything but happy. He knew that another spirit would also inhabit his wielder's inner world. He knew there would be tough times ahead for his wielder. He knew Ichigo would need to train hard to learn and master all his power. He knew there would be war and death in the future and that Ichigo would have to take life. What the man couldn't imagine was what just occurred. Now he was unable to communicate with his wielder, and his beautiful, peaceful, sunny meadow had changed to a very unpeaceful freezing glacier. Not only this, but there was not one but two new spirits. An inverted albino clone of Ichigo, the only other spirit that was supposed to be there. But the one that was not supposed to be here was the very shocked Ice Princess. Across from the man and the inverted Ichigo stood a pale-skinned woman with waist-length pale lavender hair and ice-blue eyes. The white kimono-wearing woman gracefully walked around pretending to not notice the other spirit's deathly glares. She compared Ichigo's inner world to Rukia's. Once she looked around, her attention refocused on the other inhabitants of this inner world. She sighed and pondered as to what was going to happen now. Ichigo made his way downstairs, his soft footsteps breaking the silence. The silence was a sign that everyone in the house was either asleep or was not home. Ichigo guessed that his sisters and his father were already asleep given the time, so that just left Rukia. Her mission would be ending soon, but that didn't explain his currently empty closet the midget had made her home in. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Ichigo yawned as he turned the corner and walked around the house searching for Rukia. He frowned when he couldn't find her in the living room. His frown only deepened when he made it to the empty dark kitchen, the last place in the house he had yet to search, and didn't see her. Where the hell did she go? He whispered. He knew that there wasn't a hollow nearby. He would have sensed it. When there was a hollow, he would have already been out of the window before his closet-dwelling midget could have opened the door. If it wasn't so late, Ichigo would have thought that she just went out with some friends that she had made while she went to school with him. The only time Rukia got to spend with her friends was if Ichigo wasn't around or when she went out with them after school. When Rukia would be around Ichigo, no one would come up to talk to them. In fact, no one would dare to interact with Ichigo at all unless they were being forced to. His permanent scowl and the widely known knowledge that he would often get into fights when out of class scared everyone off. All of that and add to his recent behavior. For the last 2 months, Ichigo would just randomly run out of class, or at least that's what everyone thought it was. The reality, which no one other than Rukia had known, a hollow had appeared, and he went to take care of it. Ichigo turned around ready to go to his room and fall asleep. He believed Rukia would come back later, so there was no point in him getting worried. He was about to leave the kitchen when someone called out to him. Ichigo, the voice of Ichigo's father. Isshin sat in the corner of the room at a small table. Ichigo tensed, expecting an attack from his father. His father would attack him at any time he could, saying that it was his duty to prepare his son and that he was making Ichigo stronger. When no attack came, Ichigo flipped on the light switch and looked towards the corner his father was in, who in turn pulled out a chair for him. Ichigo approached the chair and sat down, expecting another lecture on why he needs to scowl less. Are you looking for Rukia? She's probably out hunting hollows. Yeah. Ichigo stopped himself and looked at his father, who was now sporting a massive grin. How did you know? No, that question wasn't right. How long have you known? Ichigo, did you really think you could hide my third daughter in your closet forever? Isshin asked, clearly enjoying this. Third daughter? Rukia's not your daughter. Ichigo quickly retorted. Isshin raised an eyebrow. Oh yes, she is, and you just wait. Unless there's already someone who's caught your eye. He accused. Who is she? Will she give me grandchildren? What? Nobody. Ichigo again stopped and gave a low growl which quickly shut his father up. An uncomfortable and awkward silence passed over them. Neither of them wanted to talk about the obvious. To Ichigo, he didn't even know where to begin. His father knew about the closet midget Rukia and hollows, which meant that his suspicions were true. His father is a soul reaper. Was a soul reaper? Something along those lines. It wasn't that much of a leap to figure his father was a soul reaper. Ichigo could see spirits for as long as he could remember, and Rukia had told him that no one should be able to see soul reapers. It only made sense that one of his parents was spiritually aware. Isshin, on the other hand, even now continued to try and find excuses for himself. He really didn't want to tell Ichigo about everything. He wanted his son to have a normal and peaceful life away from the spiritual world. But as he continued to think about his son, he could feel his Ryatsu leaking. There wasn't really an option anymore. Everything he had tried had failed. So Rukia has taught you quite a bit, hasn't she? Yeah, according to her it's mostly the basics. I think she's still worried I'm going to fall and be impaled on my own blade, or that I'm going to do something stupid and die. Isshin lightly chuckled. That's something I can see you doing. Ichigo gave a huff and turned his head away. How close are her powers to returning? She's been here a couple of months now. Her mission should be ending soon. Her power is almost back. She's been able to use Kido for the last few weeks. Although, my Ryatsu should be decreasing as I lose her power, but instead it's still rising. Ichigo commented. Isshin nodded. His son's Ryatsu was continuing to rise even as he was holding back his Ryatsu. That only meant one thing. It was his power and not Rukia's that was currently rising. Did my third daughter teach you about Zanpakuto? Isshin asked. Ichigo just sighed and gave a nod of confirmation. Then a question crossed his mind. After Rukia gets her power back, I'll get my own Zanpakuto, right? I even talked to him right before Rukia broke into my room. Wait, you've already talked to him? Isshin asked, suddenly remembering the night Rukia gave Ichigo power, and the burst of Ryatsu that made him and Kisuke go check it out. Only once, he said sadly. Either Rukia's power is blocking us from talking or he's incredibly mad and is ignoring me. It's probably Rukia's power. NYWYS. Isshin leaned down to pick up a small wooden box and placed it on the table in between him and his son. Ichigo remained quiet as his father opened the box and pulled out a metal 5-pointed cross. This was your mother's. Isshin placed the cross into Ichigo's hand, who inspected it. It was her Quincy cross. Ichigo opened his mouth to talk, but words refused to leave. He hadn't expected both his parents to be spiritually aware. He couldn't stop his mind from wandering to his mother's death, and if she was a Quincy, then why couldn't she fight back? Ichigo Ishin paused. I lost my powers when I met your mother. She lost her powers a couple of months before her death. Ichigo's eyes widened. When it happened, your mother became very sick. She tried her best to hide it from you and the girls, but the truth is she was dying. Ishin said softly. How? What? How did she lose her powers? I truly don't know. Me and a couple of friends investigated it, and couldn't find anything. Ichigo's Ryatsu exploded outward in a show of anger, causing items on the counter to fly off. The small shadows in all corners of the room grew like vines up the walls and across the floor and turned pitch black. The shadows closest to him created a barrier where the light from the ceiling was unable to pass. The shadows had split the room down the middle, one side that had light and black vines in the other, a dark and barely visible half where both Ichigo and Ishin sat. Ishin could only watch in fascination as almost immediately afterwards the Ryatsu stopped and was reeled back. That's new was all the out-of-breath Ichigo could say before relaxing back into his uncomfortable chair. I almost want to do that again, he said as a grin appeared on his face. Ishin looked back over at Ichigo and couldn't help his own grin. Getting back on topic, Ichigo asked, you said friends, other Soul Reapers? Other exiles who happen to be Soul Reapers, Ishin replied. You were exiled from the Soul Society? Well, I wasn't technically. They think I'm dead, Ishin said with a goofy smile. But if they were to find out that I was alive, I would be labeled a traitor for abandoning my division. All of Ichigo's slight movements stopped. You were a captain? You. Was the Soul Society that desperate? Ishin faked a hurt expression while Ichigo continued to spiral. People other Soul Reapers called you Captain Kurosaki. No, they called me Captain Shiba, Ishin happily stated while sporting the largest grin possible. Ichigo might as well have been run over by a truck because nothing made sense. His father was a Shiba, part of a great noble clan. His father noble. Those words could never possibly be in the same sentence. Rukia had told him that nobles were always proper and elegant. Nothing like his father. If his father really was a Shiba, that would make Ichigo also a Shiba. And if the rest of the Shibas acted the same way his father did, he had no interest in meeting them. While Ichigo's mind raced, Ishin behind his smile was thinking of how exactly to tell his son that as happy as he was, he still didn't want this to happen. Ichigo, I had a seal placed in you, Ishin said very quickly, a couple of years ago by a very talented friend. What? Ichigo asked, not quite sure if what he heard was correct. Ishin tried to get out of it. I had a very talented friend a couple of years ago. Dad, Ichigo menacingly growled. Alright, I sort of had a friend put a seal on you to limit your Ryatsu in hope that if we caught it early enough your Ryatsu would be stunted and stop you from becoming spiritually aware. Ishin had spoken with a shame-filled voice and then turned it completely around. But no need to worry because as soon as Rukia's power is back, we can undo it, and you can get your very own Zanpakuto. Okay, that was all Ichigo could say. No other words came to mind. Was he supposed to be mad that his father wouldn't have allowed his son to choose whether he wanted to be spiritually aware? It seems like he should be mad, and yet he really wasn't, because he was and was going to get his own Zanpakuto soon. You said you lost your powers, so your spiritual awareness. But you knew about Rukia being a Soul Reaper, which means that you had to see her in soul form. He paused. Does that mean that your powers are back? Ishin stood up and yawned, then smiled at his son, which Ichigo took as a yes to his question. Ishin then turned like he was going to walk out of the room when he did a 180 and punched Ichigo square in the face, causing him and the chair he was sitting on to fall backwards. Ah, Ichigo cursed. His father gave a giggle and said, You must always be prepared, my son. Before quickly leaving the room, Ichigo would have chased his father up the stairs and beat him in the hall, but his sisters were currently sleeping. So, he just sighed and walked up the stairs and into his room. His eyes went to his desk. Opening his drawer and grabbing a glove with a flaming skull. Putting on the glove, Ichigo hit himself in the chest with it, ripping his body from his soul. Of course, there were better methods for this, like a mod soul. But he would only use his mod soul, Khan, when there was no other choice. Khan was a pervert, and Ichigo refused to give his body over unless the situation was dire. That's why at times like this, when there was no rush and no danger, he would use Rukia's glove. Ichigo caught his body and gently laid it down on his bed. Going to open his window, he was stopped when a muffled yell came from the wall, where a stuffed animal lion was hanging by tape. Its mouth also taped over, muffling his yells. Inside this stuffed animal was Khan. Ichigo, ignoring the sound, just turned back towards the window, opening it, and jumped out, not giving a second glance to the stuffed lion. Solidifying the air below him, he flash-stepped away, searching for Rukia's concealed Ryatsu. 15 minutes passed before he finally found her. Rukia was on the outskirts of a nearby park. Rukia could feel Ichigo searching for her and tried to hide as much of her Ryatsu. It seemed to be in vain because after a while he made a straight line towards her. "Damn me for teaching him how to sense Ryatsu," she whispered, mentally berated herself. But in all reality, after spending the last 2 months close to each other, Ichigo could sense Rukia's Ryatsu the best. Ichigo appeared in front of Rukia, breaking her from her thoughts. "Rukia, what are you doing out here? What are you doing here?" she responded. Ichigo raised an eyebrow, "Looking for you." "How about you? I wanted to go for a peaceful walk and now, you're ruining it. Go home, idiot." Ichigo knew something was up. "What's wrong?" Rukia just gave a sad smile and gave a heavy sigh, showing him her Denryu Shinki. Ichigo didn't have to look at the message, he already knew what it was. They had talked about it many times. What would happen if the Soul Society found out that Rukia gave her powers to him? How did they find out? Ichigo asked. "I don't know. We haven't done anything that would be seen as suspicious or fought anything big enough to get the Soul Society's attention." She paused to look back at him. "Right?" A hint of accusation in her voice. He responded, "Of course not." Rukia's accusing eyes lingered on Ichigo a few moments longer before moving to the ground as she continued to think. Her mission was being cancelled and a pair of Soul Reapers were coming to escort her back to the Soul Society. The message contained no information on why, but it didn't matter. Soul Reapers were never recalled early from a mission. They may receive an update but were never recalled, let alone be given an escort. "You can't go." Rukia was taken aback by just a couple of words. Her violet eyes found his amber before she responded, "Ichigo, we decided that if we got caught, the only option was for me to go with them, willingly. If I don't, they will label me a traitor and an order will go out for both of our deaths. A couple of years in a cell is worth it over death. You agreed to that. That's because when we made the agreement you were just a mean midget. But now you're a mean closet-dwelling midget who is also my friend," he said sincerely. Rukia closed her eyes. "Ichigo, go home," she said softly. "This is your chance to get away from being a Soul Reaper and to live life. They'll be here soon. Actually, we are already here." Ichigo and Rukia turned towards the new voice. Standing across from them was a man covered in tribal tattoos, his red hair pulled back in a ponytail and a headband over his forehead. "Rinji, don't." Rukia tried to say more but her vocal cords stopped working when her eyes drifted behind Rinji. Standing in a captain's white haori was a silver-haired man with what could only be described as a sinister face. Said man had the largest grin and slits for eyes. Ichigo just looked on with both curiosity and slight fear. Rukia had told him of her former best friend Rinji, the lieutenant of Squad 6. And there was no way he could miss who this captain was. He recalled Rukia having chills describing him over a month ago, and right now, he himself was not too far off from doing the same. No one would want to admit it but Ichigo. Looking at the situation in front of him, his foremost thought was that he was severely addition. If this couldn't be solved vocally, then it would with their Zanpakuto. He was sure they couldn't hurt Rukia, but he was free game. He knew that even if they had seals that limited their power to 1/5, the fight would be difficult. He might be able to win against Rinji, but a fight with the captain would mean certain death. There was always the option to run. Ichigo had become quite good with flash step, but still his 2 months of experience would be nothing compared to their decades. Even though he had a pretty good teacher, running would not work. At present time Ichigo was staring at the captain Jin Ikamaru, who was staring right back, scowl-met smile. Jin's Ryatsu stayed impassive and non-threatening as he moved and leaned up next to a tree, all the while keeping eye contact. Ichigo turned when he felt the fuming, anger-filled Ryatsu directed right at him from Rinji, who took a step forward, his hand holding the hilt of his sheathed blade. "Rukia, is this the bastard who stole your power?" Renji gritted his teeth, wanting nothing more than to end the orange-haired teenager standing across from himself. Ichigo just mimicked Renji's movements, his hand on his own Zanpakuto while Rukia's Zanpakuto. I didn't steal anyone's power. His words only seemed to enrage Renji. Shut up, bastard. I wasn't talking to you. Renji, stop. Ichigo didn't steal my power. That was it. Rukia saying Ichigo's name broke the string that was holding Renji back. He unsheathed his blade and advanced. I'll kill him. I'll return your power. Talking could not have gone worse. In a matter of seconds, diplomacy had failed. All that was left to do was fight. Ichigo took a step forward, unsheathing his Zanpakuto, putting himself in between Rukia and Renji. Then just like that the fight started, Renji flashed, stepping into the face of Ichigo, trying to decapitate him. When the attack was blocked, he immediately struck again and again, trying to overpower the orange-haired teen. Ichigo, on the other hand, was having none of it. Staying on the defense and giving space along with swift strikes against Renji's Zanpakuto, waiting for an opening. A single street light illuminated the striking blades and by extension their wielders. A slight hiss was heard as Renji had drawn the first blood, a small cut just barely breaking the skin on Ichigo's lower abdomen. Renji didn't stop there. He immediately moved his blade upwards to strike at Ichigo's shoulder, which was blocked. It didn't matter too much as Renji now had an opening. He quickly punched Ichigo in the face with his free hand, causing the teen to stumble backwards. Heido No. 4 Byakurai. A bolt of lightning fired from Ichigo's free hand, hitting the advancing Renji square in the chest and knocking him off balance. Ichigo flashed step forward, catching the already off-balance Renji off guard, his Zanpakuto quickly slicing diagonally across his chest, only flash stepping away once Renji lunged forward, aiming for a lethal blow. Once away, both fighters just stared at each other. They had traded places from their original stances. The bleeding and frustrated Renji brought his hand over his Zanpakuto. He would need to go further if he wanted to kill his orange-haired opponent. Roar za! Soft words barely above a whisper cut Renji off. Bakuto No. 4. Heinawa. A yellow rope snaked around his body, tying his arms to his side. The rope wrapped around his legs, forcing Renji on his knees. His Zanpakuto forcefully taken from his hand as he felt a cold blade to his throat, slightly digging into his skin and drawing a few drops of blood. Renji blinked, tilting his head upwards. He saw Ichigo holding the blade to his neck. Turning his head, he saw Rukia, her hand extended towards him. Then it hit him, figuratively. Ichigo wasn't the one to cast the last Kido, Rukia did. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his over a century of afterlife, he was speechless. Ichigo had won, kind of. Rukia had hit Renji in the back right before he was about to release his Zanpakuto. Not exactly how he had wanted to win, but a win, nonetheless. He might have celebrated if not for the worried face of Rukia, who had just hit her former best. Along with this, there was a captain very close who started clapping. The grinning, fox-faced captain slowly approached them, swaying from side to side like a snake slithering, only stopping when Ichigo raised his Zanpakuto slightly, the blade still on Renji's neck just higher, forcing Renji to tilt his head further back. Well done. It seems Rukia has been a pretty good teacher to Ichi here, wouldn't you say, Renji? Renji opened his mouth to challenge that statement, and say that Ichigo just goes lucky, but the creepy smile on the captain's face forced his jaw shut and his head down, desperately trying to avoid the gaze. Now would you remove your Zanpakuto from Renji here's neck? The captain sighed. It would be such a pain to go back and tell the old man that a lieutenant was killed by what he would call an infant. Although, on the other hand, when I tell his stone-faced captain, he might even show an emotion. While Jin debated the pros and cons of Renji returning, Rukia and Ichigo's eyes met, a silent conversation passing between the two. With a nearly non-existent nod from Rukia, Ichigo lowered his Zanpakuto and flash-stepped as fast as he could away. The captain waited a few moments after Ichigo's escape before speaking up. Rukia, if you could let dear Renji go, the head captain would scold me if he didn't come back. Rukia released the binding on Renji, and he fell face down into the concrete, causing a slight chuckle from Jin. Now Renji, take Rukia back with you to the Soul Society while I track down the kid. I can't just let him roam around with Soul Reaper powers. Wait, you don't have to hurt him, Rukia explained. My powers are almost back. Once I return to the Soul Society, he'll lose my power. There is no need to hunt him down. No one else knows I'm a soul reaper and he'll move on with his life. The captain nodded his head in acknowledgement, while his grin grew. No need to worry. I will just have a little chat with Ichi. Renji finally spoke. He stole your power, Rukia. Anger clear in his voice as he opened a senkamin, its light illuminating the surrounding area. He went to grab Rukia to drag her into the gate when she quickly struck her hand to the wound on his chest, causing him to wince in pain. She then walked around him, grabbed him by the back of his collar, and dragged him through the gate. At the same time, she inspected his neck where his seal was placed, trying to find any similarities between her seal and his. Unfortunately for her, there were none. Renji and Rukia disappeared into the closing gate, leaving Jin there alone. His grin for the first time since arriving dropped, although his eyes stayed closed, or squinted, no one really knew. He then turned around and flash-stepped, following the trail of Ichigo's Ryatsu. Ichigo didn't know where to go. There was no doubt in his mind that the captain would be able to sense his Ryatsu, and he couldn't exactly go home. His father may have also been a captain, but there was no telling the difference in power between the two. Ichigo just couldn't risk it. Then he felt it. The captain, Jin, released his Ryatsu, which Ichigo instantly felt crawling over his skin. Jin was chasing him, and at a far faster rate than Ichigo could keep up with. Then the Ryatsu moved to Ichigo's right, forcing him to go left, and towards the opposite direction of the captain's Ryatsu. The Ryatsu moved again, forcing Ichigo to rotate in the opposite direction. Again, and again Jin changed directions, causing Ichigo to repeatedly turn. Then all at once Ichigo realized that while he may have been running from the captain, he was also being led somewhere. Jin could have easily caught up to him by now. Ichigo was being led like livestock to a slaughterhouse. And a slaughterhouse would be an overstatement, seeing as Ichigo was nearing a beat-up old warehouse district in the city. Now there was no point. Ichigo could not outrun the captain, and now he was sure he was purposefully being led somewhere. He stopped, turned around and grabbed his Zanpakuto, pulling it halfway out of its sheath before he stopped, unable to move as an extended blade came out of seemingly nowhere, entering his stomach before he had a chance to react. Then as quickly as it came, the blade retracted to its owner. Jin flash-stepped into Ichigo's line of sight, stopping once he got close. Ichigo quickly pulled the rest of his Zanpakuto out of its sheath with one hand and with the other went to his bleeding wound. For several moments nothing happened. Jin stood perfectly still, not moving an inch, while Ichigo fumbled around, unable to stand still. In fact, he was barely able to stand at all, and in a fraction of a second Jin struck, his Zanpakuto extending towards the teen. Ichigo barely managed to bring up his own Zanpakuto before the strike came. Unfortunately for him, as soon as their blades met, his shattered while Jin's continued into his chest. Ichigo didn't even know what happened then. In one moment, his blade shattered, and in the next he was lying with his back on the ground, struggling to get a full breath of air as blood slowly pooled beneath him. Jin stood over the downed teen and listened to his labored breathing. His Zanpakuto hovered over Ichigo's neck while the teen stared into his slightly opened sky-blue eyes. Ichigo's own blood dripping down the end of Jin's Zanpakuto. The captain moved his blade from side to side, smearing blood across Ichigo's neck, making it look like someone had just slit his throat. Try not to die, Ichigo. Jin's shockingly soft with a hint of sinister voice caused the already troubled breathing teen to stop cold. There is still so much that needs to happen, you wouldn't want to miss it, would you? Captain Aizen wants you out of the equation, says you're becoming an unstable variable in his plans. We all know how dangerous an unstable variable can be, too long laid plans. Jin flashed a smile as Ichigo looked on. Well, I should be going. Arrangements must be made before I return. Goodbye, Ichi. With that, Jin stepped away in a direction the Ichigo didn't care enough about. His mind was preoccupied by pain and the shocking amount of blood that covered the pavement below him. Laying in his own blood, Ichigo could feel the distinct lack of sheath on his hip, signaling the Rukia had arrived in the Soul Society, and that her remaining power inside him was gone. A raindrop hit his face, then again and again until a constant drizzle had started. That was all the noise he could hear, his struggled breath and the sound of rain. Minutes passed, maybe hours, it didn't matter. Ichigo couldn't feel his limbs, his hand that was over his bleeding gut had gone limp. He struggled to keep his eyes from shutting. If he closed them now, he would never be able to open them again. He turned his head to the side to stop the constant onslaught, though was the rain beating against his face. His view to the side was even worse as he saw all the blood he had lost. It was almost surreal to think that he was still conscious with the sheer volume that flowed away from his body. The steady sound of rain was broken by uneven footsteps, then they quickly stopped. Ichigo tilted his head but didn't see anyone. Believing that he had finally cracked and was starting to hallucinate, he let out a shaky breath and closed his eyes, ready for death to overtake him. The footsteps started up again, this time growing closer. Ichigo didn't open his eyes. He didn't have the strength to get his hopes up just for nothing to be there. The footsteps stopped right in front of him. Not looking too good there, are ya, Ichigo? Ichigo slowly opened his eyes. He was met by a brown-eyed, blonde jaw-length-haired weirdo with a giant shit-eating grin. The Vizards, a group of 8 former Soul Reapers who were exiled more than 100 years ago, currently residing inside an old warehouse. Its windows broken and its roof partially caved in, giving the building a condemned look. Looking past the beat-up exterior and through an invisible barrier, the warehouse didn't look that bad, structurally speaking. The inside was damp, the air was anything but fresh, and nearly all the furniture had a layer of dust on it. A dim-lit hallway contained their rooms while a staircase led down to the basement. This half of the warehouse was entirely different than the rest. The place was dust-free, the walls freshly painted, and the floor scrubbed. It looked inhabited. The basement was an empty Badlands landscape as far as the eye could see. Columns of rock littered the land, its walls and roof painted like the midday sky. Near the entrance was a large couch and a couple of chairs not far from it. A nice place to regain your breath before ascending a million stairs back to the warehouse. A single barrier stood not far off from the entrance. 2 of the Vizards, Lisa and Hiyori, were inside clashing while the sweaty forms of Rose, Love, Quincy, and Mishiro were off to the side watching after finishing their own spars. The barrier being provided by Hachi, a large pink-haired man with an equally pink mustache. Lisa was wearing a sailor's suit with her dark hair braided behind her, and a white hollow mask with a cross-shaped opening over her face. She blocked Hiyori's attack before grabbing a hold of the other girl and throwing her into the ground. A moment later, Hiyori was back in a fighting stance. The heavy-breathing, blonde-haired short girl had a horned hollow mask over her face. She shook with absolute rage as she observed the new tear in her red tracksuit. "Damn it," she growled, throwing her hands down in frustration. Hiyori was only slightly mad about the tracksuit. It was to be expected, it was a spare after all. She also had plenty of tracksuits saved up over her years in the human world. What she was truly frustrated about was a crack in her hollow mask that ran down her left cheek. She carefully ran her fingers over the cracked area before it chipped off, exposing part of her face. She then clawed her hand over the newly chipped area. A red glow emitted as the mask repaired itself. Once done, Hiyori brought her Zanpakuto up, about to attack Lisa when the barrier around them was removed. Hiyori quickly glared at Hachi, who controlled the barriers, then shouting in a distorted voice, "Hey! We weren't done! I was just about to." "It's over." Lisa's own distorted voice cut her off. She brought her hand over her mask and swiped it off. "You lost. You also might want to get started. It's going to take you all night to clean up Shinji's mess," she pointed out, walking past the other Vizards to any empty couch, manga already in hand. Hiyori removed her own mask, then stomped over to the rest of the Vizards. "That doesn't count. It was just a crack." Lisa lifted her eyes from her explicit manga. "You had to repair your mask. It counts. You really shouldn't have offered that bet." Hiyori huffed. "Shinji should be the one cleaning. He made the mess. The jackass can't cook, can't fight, can't lead," she yelled, growing more aggravated by the second. Her hands twitched towards her sandals, ready to smack anyone and everyone. "Where is the pervert anyways?" He went to see the trio at the tourist trap again. "Quincy," the silver-haired man spoke. Love stood up from the chair he sat in, adjusted his sunglasses. His dark afro bounced with the movement. "We must be getting close. How many times have they met up in the last month? 6-7 times? Quincy nodded before reminding everyone there. "We still have things to do before we're ready to go. Most importantly, check if Ishin's son is a Vizard and then train." Mishiro bounced around the corner. What happens if the berry isn't one of us? Will he be coming with us? Rose was the first to speak. I assumed so, especially if what Yoruichi said about the Soul Society is true. Then we could use another Vizard or at least another Zanpakuto. He turned his head looking at the gathered crowd. But we really need another Vizard around here. Some wanted to be offended statement but couldn't. 100 years with 8 people in the same warehouse got old, fast. They were in desperate need of a new person around, and when word reached them of Ichigo, they got their hopes up. Once Ichigo got Rukia's powers, Ishin had explicitly told everyone not to interact with Ichigo until he told him everything. They of course agreed. His father should be the one to tell Ichigo about all the exiles and have him deal with a mountain of questions. Love sat down next to Lisa, looking over her shoulder to read the title. You got another one of those? He requested. Lisa pointed over to a crate filled with them. The man happily made his way over, grabbing the top 3, then returning to his seat. Hiyori sulked past the duo, mumbling about going to kill Shinji once the man got back. A landline phone not too far off from them began beeping. Kensei and Rose looked between each other, mentally challenging the other. Even as the phone continued to ring, either moved from their spot. Mashiro, seeing that no one was going to get it, ran over and picked up the receiver. Get Hachi to open the barrier. And I'm going to need some help. Ichigo's a little banged up. Mashiro shot forward at an impressive pace and shouted, Hachi, open the barrier. Ichiberry's hurt. On reflex, Hachi opened his normal pathway in the warehouse barrier, then quickly got to his feet. This whole year, there wasn't very much that would get the Vizards sprinting up the stairs right after a spar. Which is exactly what all of them were doing after Mashiro shouted. The poor manga had been unceremoniously thrown in the air when Love and Lisa jumped from the couch. Both Love and Rose had stumbled multiple times on their way to the stairwell. Hiyori was the closest and furthest ahead. They all arrived at the entrance to find Shinji dragging the bleeding Ichigo inside. Hiyori rushed over, immediately at his side, but not in a helpful manner. Perhaps she didn't know Ichigo was bleeding out, or at the present time just didn't care, because in one swift move she flicked her sandal off her foot, grasped it midair, and in the same swing smacked Shinji across the face. The smack caused the blonde to lose grip on Ichigo, dropping him to the cold floor. Kensei immediately rushed over and grabbed Ichigo's legs while Shinji quickly recovered and got his arms. Together they picked up the semi-conscious Ichigo and moved for the closest table, which, like everything else on this side of the warehouse, was cluttered. Rose picked up on what they were doing and dramatically swept his arm over the table, pushing everything on top to the floor with a loud crash. As soon as Ichigo was placed on the table, Hachi was over him, his hands over the teen's main wound and emitting a green glow. Shinji backed away from the table for a second, giving time for the blonde to be questioned. What happened to him? Kensei questioned. Shinji removed his black, partially blood-stained cloak. Soul Society took the girl. It seems Ichigo was there when it happened, and Jin, well, he pointed to Ichigo, cut him up a little. Shinji gave a chuckle. Hiyori went over to them, sandal still in hand. Dumbass fought a captain. Kensei gave a light snort. I doubt it was a fight. Jin easily would have killed him. His forehead wrinkled with thought. Why didn't he kill Ichigo? Shinji looked over Ichigo's wounds, which were beginning to close. Will he be alright? He asked with a hint of worry. The blonde didn't know if it was more for Ichigo or himself. He didn't want to have to tell the teen's father that they failed to save his son's life. All attention was on Hachi, waiting for the answer. Ichigo should be fine in a day or 2. Hachi stopped healing and looked over the scar that took the wound's place. He's healing faster than I would have thought. Do we know if he heard his Zanpakuto yet? Hachi asked, inspecting the rest of Ichigo for any discoloration. Shinji shrugged, then responded. I don't know. We'll have to wait till he wakes up or go ask Ishin. Hiyori huffed. I can wake the baldy up right now. She grabbed her sandal and was mid-swing on the unconscious Ichigo's head when Lisa grabbed her arms and dragged her away. Hiyori thrashed about in Lisa's arms. Let go of me! She screamed. Shut up, the adults are talking, so go play with your dolls. Lisa suggested, kicking Hiyori into the closest room and slamming the door shut, locking it in the process. Hiyori loudly growled. Maybe I'll just go and read your porn. She screamed through the door. Go right ahead. In fact, why don't you take notes for when a chibi-sized man comes along? What's that short captain's name again? Lisa yelled back, smirking when the door rattled and nearly broke altogether. Hiyori may not have been able to see Lisa, but she could hear the smirk in her voice, and it did nothing but make her more irritated. She waited until she heard Lisa's muffled footsteps and kicked at the door in the hope that it would swing open. Still here, Lisa called through the door, smirk clear as day on her face. All non-participating Vizards cringed as they heard crashes from the room Hiyori was in. No doubt everything that was standing was now on its side. Someone was going to have to clean up the mess left behind by Tornado Hiyori, hopefully the same person that would be cleaning Ichigo's blood stains that littered the floor. Rose made his way to the table. You said he would be fine in a day or two, but how is his blood? Because it looks like most of it is currently on our floor. Hachi hummed his agreement before concealing a smile. Yes, he has lost a tremendous amount of blood, but the lack of discoloration leads me to believe that not only his wound, but his blood is being regenerated at a much faster rate. Rose shook his head and remarked. Not just a hollow, but at least an Ajucha's level. Alright, before we all get our hopes up and jump to conclusions, his healing could be from some form of Quincy bullshit. Kensei pointed out, instantly bringing the people around him down. The sound of Hiyori trashing the room began to slow. Hopefully her anger had come down to a manageable level. Lisa left the locked door and returned to the rest of them. So who's going to tell Ishin that his only son is laying injured in the last place he wanted? The group all looked at Shinji, who crossed his arms and stomped his foot. No way, I already had to lug his bleeding son here. Someone else has to do it, Kensei frowned. You're our leader, and you were the one to bring him here. Take one for the team and go get pummeled by Ishin. Shinji violently shook his head. That was never voted on, and what was I supposed to do? The candy shop was too far away, and he was bleeding out. Kensei patted Shinji on the back. You make sure to tell Ishin that when he stops punching you. Shinji could tell that he was losing this argument and was looking around frantically, searching for anyone that would help. His eyes met with Love's, who after a brief staring contest muttered curses, then stalked back to the hallway and into his room, returning with a black cloak over his head and body. Love stopped at Shinji's side and whispered in the blonde's ear. If Ishin attacks me, you will hope that I club you to death. Shinji gulped as he and everyone else watched Love open the metal warehouse door and leave before slamming it shut. Love quickly left the barrier and Flash stepped out of the warehouse district and over to the Kurosaki residence. It took a couple of minutes before he reached the house, but that time was valuable. He had to think of how to naturally bring up Ichigo's injury at near midnight. He landed in the driveway and walked up, removing his sunglasses and placing them down next to some bushes. Safer taking them off now than having them broken by a fist later. In the few minutes Love had while Flash stepping, the idea of just walking in and subduing Ishin before he could react was promising. Unfortunately, it was just not his day. Nearly all the lights inside were on. There was no turning back now. Before Love could knock on the door, it was already open with a menacing-looking Ishin fixed in the doorway, blood staining his hands. Behind Ishin was one bucket hat-wearing shopkeeper with a blood-covered cane. Ah, Love, to what do we owe the pleasure on this rainy? Ishin cut Kasuka off with a low growl. Do you want to tell me where my son is and why his body is dead upstairs? Love's eyes danced around as he tried to think of an answer and found a moving stuffed lion whose own dark eyes reflected the fear of God. Love turned back to Ishin and only had one name for him. Shinji. As the light of the Senkamin died down, Rukia and Renji came face to face with her brother and captain of the 6th Division. Both gave a quick bow to the captain. Byakuya Kuchiki was once a rambunctious man who got into trouble often, but that man was no more. Becoming head of his noble clan and the death of his wife turned him into a cold and impassive man. His long black hair flowed onto the back of his captain's Hiyori. Byakuya walked up to the pair while Rukia suddenly found the patterns on the floor very interesting, not wanting to stare into the judgmental eyes of her brother. Instead of even glancing her way, the man strictly focused on his lieutenant. Captain Ive. Byakuya cut Renji off before the crimson-haired man could get any further. Go to the 4th Lieutenant Abarai. Renji's hand went to his shallow wound, causing the clotted cut to start bleeding again. Captain, he snarled, glancing at Rukia, then Flash stepping away, leaving the two siblings alone. Byakuya paid no attention to his lieutenant's tone, and kept his gaze away from Rukia, refusing to look her way. Neither wanted to look at each other. While on their way back from the living world, Rukia's Zanpakuto returned to her. The spirit mumbled in her head, giving her the courage to raise her gaze. Byakuya, without saying a word, held out his hand, motioning for her Zanpakuto. Rukia grabbed her sheathed blade and hesitantly gave it over. Byakuya then swiftly turned around. "Follow me," he commanded as he walked off back towards the 6th Division. Rukia fell in line behind her brother. A part of her was confused about why they were walking. Her brother wasn't going to talk to her, and the streets were empty. Another part of her was glad, as the longer it took them to reach the 6th Division, the more time she spent outside of shackles. With this extra time, she couldn't help but think of what her future held. She would spend years inside a prison. But then what? Would she be stripped of her seated position in the 13th Division? Could she even be a Soul Reaper again? If not, then what? Would she have to stay at the Kuchiki estate all day? Would the Kuchiki clan banish her? As they approached the 6th Division barracks, every step became heavy with anticipation. Her heartbeat was so loud she worried Byakuya would hear and judge her. Loitering at the entrance was a small group of Soul Reapers eyeing the streets and looking for their target. These Soul Reapers clearly did not belong to the 6th Division. For one, they were outside at night while not being on patrol, and second, they were openly disgracing the surrounding scenery, spitting on plants and shrubbery, kicking at the walls and chipping paint. The three-strong group caught sight of the Byakuya. "Captain Kuchiki." One of them approached the siblings. Byakuya glared at them before questioning their presence. "You are not from this division, yet you trespass?" The Soul Reaper began to enclose at a respectable distance from the siblings. "Captain Ikimara has ordered us to take the prisoner into the 3rd Division's custody." Byakuya took an intimidating step. "As my lieutenant brought back the prisoner, she is in my custody." The Soul Reaper stopped in his tracks. "Captain Kuchiki, surely you can see the conflict of interest, considering the prisoner is your own sister." Byakuya's glare switched to that of murderous intent, causing all 3 Soul Reapers to uncomfortably shift. "Leave my division, or I will have you forcefully removed." When no one moved, Byakuya's hand grasped his Zanpakuto in a clear warning. 2 of the Soul Reapers grabbed their own blades while the third, and smarter one, backed off. Before a fight could break out, the smarter Soul Reaper smacked the heads of his 2 companions, getting them to cool down. The 3 turned to leave, but not before one of them had spit on the ground. Byakuya, without looking back, walked through the entrance. The halls were deserted as they passed corner after corner, and a set of stairs that led to a door. Inside was a giant private cell with 3 walls and a tiny inescapable window. The entrance wall was opened with crossing metal bars, and in the middle was a large metal door. Although large, the cell was bare, only containing a futon shoved against the back corner. With the swipe of Byakuya's hand, an audible click was heard. The captain grasped the handle and pulled it open for Rukia, who obediently entered. He swiped his hand over the door again, then spoke like he was reading off a list. "This lock cannot be opened by anyone other than me. Your trial is tomorrow evening when Central 46 meets. Until then, no one else is allowed in this room. Food will be given in the morning. Captain Yukitake has requested to see you once your trial is over." The stoic noble said the older captain's name with disdain. She nodded, then furrowed her brow. Something didn't seem right here. She expected at least some type of cuff. "Why am I not shackled?" she asked. Byakuya turned away from her. "Shackles are not necessary when in this cell. I don't believe you will escape." Byakuya reached the outer door before halting at Rukia's voice. "Brother, I'm sorry, but I had no choice giving over my power." She paused, thinking whether to tell him about someone placing a limiter on her. "If I didn't, I would have died," she added, leaving out some very important information. "Very well," was all he said before slamming the outer door shut and walking towards his office. Rukia sat down on the futon, questioning why she didn't tell him anything. But her resolve came quickly when the thought of her clan came to mind. She had been in the Kuchiki clan for several decades now, and everyone still treated her like shit. Trash from the outer Rukangai, that is what all the elders thought of her. But that wouldn't have mattered if her brother accepted her. Byakuya was anything but a sibling, avoiding her like the plague. never showing any emotion and, at times, when in her presence, refusing to talk to her. Her time in the human world and seeing how Ichigo acted towards his sisters had shown her how a true brother acted. She had tried to gain her brother's acceptance by climbing through the ranks of her division. But for decades, even after training under a lieutenant, her captain denied her a seated position. It didn't make sense. There were open spots, and she was stronger than many of the current seated officers. It didn't make sense, until asking Captain Yukitake about it. The man had a face of guilt, and looked like someone whose hands were tied. He may not have said anything, but she connected the dots. If there was one person that didn't want her to succeed, it was Byakuya. That's why she was initially confused when a month later Captain Yukitake offered her a seated position. Ever since Byakuya had begun making comments about the older captain, giving away that Yukitake had defied the noble's wishes. So yes, Rukia knew why she didn't tell Byakuya that someone was out to get her. Was the seal even still in place? Captains and lieutenants had theirs automatically removed once returning to the Soul Society. To check, she would need a reflective surface. Unfortunately for her, nothing like that was in her cell. Sighing and laying on her back, she retreated to her inner world. A pleasant chill ran down her spine when glancing at her Zanpakuto. The elegant woman was in total relief. She had finally made it back to her wielder and inner world. Rukia couldn't stop a grin when watching the spirit's face. Was being with Ichigo that bad? She teased. The elegant woman shook her head, letting her hair fly around. Ichigo was not the problem I am relieved to get away from. One of the spirits in his inner world was quite persistent. Rukia's violet eyes quickly became saucers before sputtering. What? Ichigo's a human. He wouldn't have her face dropped. Spirits more than one? Rukia, I'm afraid your friend is anything but a human. As Ichigo gradually returned to consciousness, a distant voice rang through his head. He blinked his eyes multiple times, and nothing changed. Surroundings so dark he couldn't see the hand he brought to his temple. The freezing surface beneath his bare torso shot through his nerves, causing him to roll to his side to avoid the uncomfortable sensation. Ichigo rolled right off the freezing table and onto the numbing floor. The distant voice mumbled something before it stopped, and then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the voice cut right through any of his previous thoughts. Ichigo, Ichigo. Ichigo clutched his head. I hear you, so stop yelling at me. He hypocritically yelled back. The teen scowled when he felt more than one being smirk back at him. Before he could even reflect on what that was, a blinding light interrupted the darkness around him. He shielded his eyes with his arm, while his other propped him up into a sitting position. As Ichigo's eyes adjusted to the newfound light, it flickered multiple times, grabbing his attention. He brought down the arm and saw Shinji, sitting in what could only be described as a very uncomfortable chair with his legs on another. His hand gripped the light switch, continuously flicking it up and down. Who you talking to, Ichigo? The voice in my head. He blurted out without thinking. Shinji gave a snicker as he let go of the light switch and gracefully smacked his legs against the arm of the chair, eliciting a muffled yelp. Shinji's yelp shook Ichigo's memory. He looked down to find his once opened wound closed and, in its place, the faintest of scars. He trailed his fingers over the mark, admiring the healing that was done. Whoever had healed him was on a completely different level than Rukia. She had healed him once, and while the wound had closed, and the pain had vanished, there was still a noticeable scar in its place. You can thank me for that, Kia voice began telling him, but was cut off and became a distant mumble. Ichigo froze upon hearing the new voice. His first thought was maybe he misheard, or that the man he believed to be his Zanpakuto had a split personality. Or even more likely, he was going crazy and none of this was real. His thoughts were rudely interrupted when Shinji walked across the room and held out his hand, helping Ichigo off the floor. Ichigo, by chance do you know who I am? Shinji questioned, taking a step back and holding his breath. In Ichigo's mind there was only one answer. At this point, any stranger that knew his name was at one point from the spirit world. Another exile? He guessed. Shinji breathed a sigh of relief. Good, so your father told you everything. He proceeded towards the door and opened it. Come on, since you're no longer bleeding out or in pain, let's go get you your Zanpakuto and see if you're one of us. Ichigo couldn't stop the smile that began to creep across his lips when Shinji said he was getting his own Zanpakuto. However, his brow furrowed hearing the rest. One of who? Shinji blinked, taken aback by Ichigo's confusion. One of the Vizards, he explained, pausing to make eye contact when Ichigo didn't budge. Do you know what a Vizard is? Shinji cautiously questioned. Shinji knew that if Ishin hadn't said anything, then he was currently walking on a minefield, and his question had just set off a chain reaction. Ichigo responded with a loud groan. I don't even know your name, he frustratedly exclaimed, growing tired of constantly being left in the dark. Shinji facepalmed. Your father didn't tell you shit, did he? He hopefully asked. Ichigo shrugged and Shinji's hopes sank. Okay, let's start with what your father did tell you. Well, he said that he was once a former captain and that my mother was a Quincy. That he was now in exile and there were other exiles that he wanted me to meet once I lost Rukia's powers and gained my own. Ichigo paused for dramatic effect before finishing with a scowl. Oh, and that he had my power sealed. Shinji sighed and buried his face in his hands. Is that all he told you? Shinji asked in between breaths. Yeah, okay, Shinji said, as he looked up at an analog clock over the door. He flipped a phone out of his pocket and taped it only once before a ringing sound went off and someone else answered. What do you want, Baldy? Change of plans? Stall Ishin for as long as you can. Do anything necessary. For a few moments, silence remained before someone spoke again. Anything? The voice questioned mischievously. Hiyori, you cannot hurt or threaten anyone. Hiyori was mid-growl when Shinji hung up the phone. His attention turned back to the orange-haired teen in front of him. Shinji took a deep breath before speaking. Well, your father did technically tell you, so I don't see the harm in being the generous friend that I am and filling in the points that he missed. The blonde grew a grin. Why don't we start over? He once again held out his hand. Shinji Hirako, former captain of the 5th Division and unofficial leader of the Vizards. Ichigo shook his head along with the blonde's hand. Of course, he had to be another former captain. Ichigo Kurosaki, absolutely no one. He paused as a thought came to the forefront of his mind that sought an answer. How long have I been asleep? He looked towards the table in the middle of the cluttered-filled room. Shinji glanced back up at the clock before answering. A few hours at most, but that doesn't matter anymore. He then about-faced and walked through the open door, motioning for Ichigo to follow. Ichigo stopped at the doorway and looked down both ways of the hallway, just trying to figure out where the hell he was. Shinji meanwhile hurried down the hall, forcing Ichigo to jog to catch up. Why are we rushing? Ichigo inquired when they took a turn into a large room piled high with boxes. Your father didn't tell you everything. Not even half of it, which either means he was going to tell you the rest later or he was going to throw you to the wolves. Shinji explained, shimmying between large piles of boxes, opening each in hope of what he was looking for. Shinji spoke up again while tossing things around. I can only imagine the rage he has right now with Hiyori over at your house. He raised his hand to stop the question that was on the tip of Ichigo's tongue. She's there to help with the panic, don't know why considering she's would cause most of it. He rolled his eyes and smiled as he found a sheathed katana under a large box. Ichigo tilted his head. You said stall him by any means necessary? Shinji looked up. Oh yeah, your house is probably burned down by now. It's a good thing nothing that important is there. The teen raised his eyebrows. My body and my sister's are there. The blonde paled as he grabbed the asachi from the floor and unceremoniously tossed it to the teen, who fumbled with it before getting a good grip. Well, your sisters are fine, and he paused, thinking what was the best way to address this situation. Your body is dead, Shinji calmly stated, just ripping the metaphoric band-aid off. Ichigo's eyes widened to an impossible size. What? Ho, he vocally stumbled, barely able to string together a coherent word. He was dead, stuck in soul form. It didn't matter anyways because Shinji cut him off. Which brings me to my next question. He looked right into Ichigo's eyes. Why are you alive? I mean, Jin injured your soul form, but he didn't kill you and then went out of his way to go and kill your body. Ichigo barely listened to a word the blonde said. He stood there like a statue, not answering Shinji as the man tried to get his attention. He was dead and didn't even live past his teen years. No one would be able to see him. His sisters wouldn't be able to see him. Ichigo took a long breath to try and compose himself from his spiral. It didn't work. I don't know. I remember him saying try not to die and then walking off. Ichigo pathetically replied, his mind once again racing with a million questions and no answer. Shinji walked over to the katana holding teen. What you're holding right now is an Asachi, he said, pointing to the katana. All new Soul Reapers are given one to pour their Ryatsu into over a couple of years, resulting in a unique Zanpakuto. Now we don't have that kind of time, so the goal is to release your seal and reflect your built-up Ryatsu into the Asachi. Ichigo remained inattentive to anything Shinji said when going through more boxes. So my body is dead and now I'm stuck in soul form? Ichigo hesitantly asked. Shinji hummed. But being in soul form isn't that bad, and hey, we can always get you a Jigai. Shinji replied, rummaging through a mountain of clothing. The statement somehow managed to help calm Ichigo. And Hiyori is she? Shinji gave an answer before Ichigo could finish the question, a Vizard and a bitch. Mumbling the end, the teen watched Shinji go through the clothes when he felt like he was forgetting something. He glanced down to find himself naked from the waist up. He shivered, trying to get the freezing temperature of his exposed skin under control. Shinji quickly tossed the shirt to Ichigo, who grabbed it with his free hand and struggled to turn the article of clothing the right way. Put this on. You walk out there. He pointed at the door on the other end of the hallway. Shirtless, and Lisa might kill you. He paused, thinking over what he just said for a moment. Or she might jump you. He pointed out, clearly amused, when Ichigo turned his head to avoid showing the bit of red that threatened his cheeks. I'm not sure this shirt will fit, Ichigo pointed out. The response he got was another shirt thrown at him. This time one that fits. Ichigo quickly put it on and followed Shinji down the hallway to the door he pointed out before. Shinji stopped right in front of the door and looked at Ichigo, mentally checking things off a list before opening the door and coming face to face with 5 more people. Ichigo paled when he saw the group staring at him, while Shinji threw his arm around the teen's shoulder and forcefully dragged him inside the room. The flooring was the same cold one that continued through the entire warehouse. A decently sized kitchen sat near the corner of the room. The walls were bare and the air damp. A large unused table was situated in the middle of the room and multiple couches sat near the walls. Barry! Finally, you're here. Everyone around here is so boring. Mishiro excitedly yelled while running up and latched to the teen's arm, practically hanging from it. Shinji grinned. Ichigo, this is Mishiro, Kensei, Lisa, Rose, and Hachi, he said, pointing to each of the named people. It took a moment for Ichigo to register that standing there like a shy idiot wasn't a good first impression. Hey, he stupidly said. There was no point in introducing himself since everyone clearly already knew who he was. He looked down to find Mishiro's hazel eyes staring into his soul. Ichigo averted his gaze and found Rose and Hachi smiling at him. Kensei barely paid him attention and just watched over Mishiro with an impassive face. Lisa's only reaction was a raised eyebrow. The tangerine can talk? Lisa smirked at his scowl. Better than you can see. Ichigo instinctively responded, causing Shinji to snort and everyone to smirk. Before Lisa could skin Ichigo, Shinji had ushered him into what was once a kitchen. Dishes piled on the counters and multiple charred cabinets were scattered around, indicating that multiple fires had occurred. Shinji followed the teen's eyes and slightly paled. That was Hiyori's fault. We got to get to the basement, he said, leading the teen to a dark staircase while the others followed them. Ichigo stared at the staircase that seemed to go down forever. This reminded him of a nightmare he once had. He'd make it halfway down the stairs before being stabbed from all angles. The bespectacled Lisa walked up behind the trio and in one swift move removed Shinji's arm from around Ichigo's neck and whispered into his ear. What's wrong? Is the big bad tangerine afraid of a little darkness? I guess it's for the best. I doubt your Zanpakuto would have been anything worthwhile. Ichigo raised an eyebrow before responding with a jab of his own. If you need glasses to see in the light, I can only imagine how you'd stumble around in the dark. Be careful you don't miss a step. It seems like a long way down. Lisa grinned, then slapped the back of the teen's head. Oh, Ichigo, you should know that's not how you talk to a woman. Ichigo let out a huff and started his descent. Mishiro, still clinging to his free arm, was being dragged backwards. His neck held a slight sting, but he considered it at least half a win when Lisa didn't kill him in that moment. Ichibari? Mishiro called out to Ichigo. He ignored her, refusing to answer at that name. Berry Ichibari? Shinji leaned in and gave him much-needed advice. She'll keep going until you answer her. But Ichigo was being stubborn and decided to just ignore the blonde too. His thinking was that she would tire out eventually. Oh, was he wrong? A couple of minutes later, and not only are they still descending the dark stairwell, but Mashiro is still trying to get his attention. Stepping it up, she started hitting his arm. Barry, answer me. Please. When he still refused to look her down, she hit his arm much harder. Ichigo broke his silence. Don't call me that, he said, not looking down at the girl whose feet continued to drag against the incline. Barry? Everyone behind him snickered. What? Mashiro smiled. Are you going back with us? Ichigo raised an eyebrow and looked to Shinji for clarification. After you get some training, we are going back to the Soul Society. We won't force you to go, but wouldn't mind another Zanpakuto. Another Zanpakuto? What, you going to war? Ichigo's playful question was met with complete silence. Ichigo stopped and looked back at the bunched group. They waited for a moment looking at each other before Kensei spoke. Maybe, depends if we get attacked on sight. Ichigo continued to watch the man's face, checking for any sign that it was a joke. None. The silver-haired man was being serious. The teen wanted to answer right there, saying that he would just get himself killed going with them. But then he thought of Rukia. Could he leave her there to suffer for saving him and his family? Would he have to make a deal to get her out of it or break her out of prison? If he didn't, could he live with himself and move on like nothing ever happened? That answer was easy. No, he could not. Ichigo smirked. Yeah, I'll go. I do owe you for saving me. Besides, there's a certain midget I got to. He stopped talking once he reached the bottom step and witnessed the new world he just stepped into. What the hell is this place? Ichigo turned around to face everyone else. Is there a wizard in your group? Ichigo looked down at the dangling Mashiro. And would you please let go of my arm? Kensei walked forward to catch Mashiro as she finally let go of Ichigo's arm. None of us are wizards, but Kasuke is cutting it close. He's another exile that you'll meet later. A blaring noise brought everyone's attention to Shinji, who pulled out his phone and answered. The device may not have been in speaker mode, but that didn't stop everyone there from hearing the words loud and clear. The goat is on his way there. What happened to stalling him? You said I couldn't hurt or threaten anyone, and I ran out of things to break. Hiyori yelled, then taking a brief pause before continuing. When I started to break random things, he figured out that his baldy of a son must have woken up. Shinji, without finishing, hung up the phone and glared at the people around. Haven't you heard it's rude to eavesdrop on other people's conversations? Rose stepped forward. We need to at least start before Ishin gets here, Shinji. Shinji waved him off before turning towards the giant. All right, let's get this show on the road. Hachi, your strongest barrier, please. Everyone quickly moved out of the way while Hachi clapped his hands together, and an orange barrier surrounded Ichigo. What do I do? Ichigo felt stupid asking, but there had to be something better than just standing there. The barrier around him then shrunk while Hachi walked up. No need to worry, Ichigo. The best thing for you to do is to sit down and stay still while I remove your seal. Hachi's comforting voice told him. Ichigo sat down with his legs crossed, and the Asachi laid across his lap, waiting for what he assumed would become painful. Meanwhile, Hachi got as close as he could to the barrier and brought his palms over the back of the teen's neck. A soft glow emitted from the large man's hands as visible Ryatsu escaped from his neck. Ichigo then closed his eyes and began waiting. The sound of his own heartbeat pounding made it impossible to hear anything else. Fingers tightened around the Asachi's grip. He wasn't in pain like he expected. Instead, there was terrible pressure building within his body. His body started to limply sway as more and more Ryatsu leaked out. A slight sting of his neck and Ichigo exploded in a massive burst of Ryatsu, filling the barrier, the force of which knocked the teen unconscious. His Ryatsu struck the orange walls at a high speed and simply reflected towards its owner, and the unnamed blade at his side. Ichigo slowly opened his eyes and found himself face to face with a pair of golden irises set in a black scara. And finally, you know how long I've been waiting? Years, and as soon as you can hear the old man, that cold snow lady comes along and blocks us from talking with you. The being's eyes squinted as he grew mad just thinking about it. It wasn't until Ichigo moved back that he saw himself, or well, a bone white and inverted self. Dressed in a white shihakusho, the spirit crouched and raked its sharp black fingernails over the large stones beneath him. Are you just going to sit there like an obedient horse? Ichigo rose the ground, eyes glued on the pale man. I'd ask who you are, but I'm pretty sure I already have an idea. Although I don't know your name. The spirit looked slightly taken by surprise, then grinned and pointed his thumb at himself. Zangetsu. Zangetsu. Ichigo repeated the name, making sure not to forget before he stood up, a stupid smile plastered across his lips. An even stupider question on the tip of his tongue, but to be sure he had to ask it. So are you my Zanpakuto? Zangetsu smirked, one of them. The teen's brows drew dangerously close before following up, one of them. He asked. I am the other. A voice came from behind Ichigo that he immediately recognized. He may have only heard it once, but it was engraved into his mind. The teen turned around to face the older man, who was wearing one of the brightest smiles he had ever seen. His hair and cloak were as wild as the last time they had met. The man stepped forward, each step taken with a designated purpose. Hello, Ichigo. Ichigo's stubborn smile grew. Hey, he trailed off, hoping for a name. The older man looked amused before giving it Zangetsu. Ichigo looked between the two. You're both named Zangetsu. That won't be confusing. He sarcastically replied. I just call him old man. The older spirit gave a quick frown while the younger just rolled his eyes. If it would help avoid confusion when speaking between us, you can call me Tensa. The black-cloaked man offered. Zangetsu walked over to Tensa before talking. Alright, Kingy, now that the pleasantries are out of the way, we go a couple of things to talk about. Ichigo scowled when hearing what he hoped wasn't a nickname. Why are you calling me Kingy? He questioned. Well, you are the king of this place. Zangetsu dramatically opened his arms to the surrounding area. Surrounding the three of them was a small village of thatch-roofed wooden buildings, weaving in between narrow cobblestone pathways. Behind them were impossibly tall trees, dwarfing the meadow and its deserted inhabitants. A large open circle of precisely placed stones marked the center of the village. Small designs littered the edges, nothing too intricate, but enough that someone could see they were placed with a purpose. The next thing caught Ichigo's eyes. Outside the detailed circle and next to the largest house was multiple stacked crates with apples inside. Without a second thought he started towards them, removing the top crate and grabbing one. Before the teen could bite into his apple, Zangetsu had grabbed one in each hand, devouring the first in record time before moving on to the second. Ichigo looked on with slight concern as Zangetsu scarfed down multiple more apples. Tensa walked up behind Ichigo before explaining. In the time he's been here, Zangetsu has grown a fondness for apples. It's also given him something to do other than try and the Snow Maiden. Tensa vulgarly told. Hey, I was getting close. A couple more months and she wouldn't have been able to resist me. Tensa shook his head, remembering how often he had to thaw out the younger spirit after one of his attempts and then apologize on the pale spirit's behalf. The older spirit's attention shifted back towards his wielder. Ichigo. The teen put back his apple, then looked up at the older man. You are one of a kind. No one like you has existed. Your mother a Quincy and father a Soul Reaper. As you know, only Soul Reapers have inner worlds and a physical manifestation of their powers, or Zanpakuto. Ichigo nodded and the spirit continued. While we both might be your Zanpakuto and hold your Soul Reaper power, that is not all we are. I hold your Quincy power, while Zangetsu holds the power of a hollow, both being passed to you by your mother. The spirit calmly finished in a manner that showed that he had rehearsed this multiple times. Ichigo whipped his head around so fast any normal person would have terrible whiplash. Everything made sense until he heard that he possessed the power of a hollow. Power of a Quincy? No big deal, he expected that considering his mother was one, but a hollow was an entirely different story. He concluded that this was something important that his father forgot to tell him. Sorry, I don't think I heard you correctly. Did you say hollow from my mother? Correct me if I'm wrong, but hollows are poisonous to a Quincy. Yes, under normal circumstances your soul would painfully disintegrate. But that doesn't factor in your Soul Reaper power. With it, no part of your soul is fighting for dominance over the others. Just stop worrying, will ya? We're fine. We're not some fragile little bitch. Zangetsu complained. Ichigo rolled his eyes and exclaimed. Were you not listening to anything he said, because it sounds pretty fragile to me? Zangetsu shrugged. We're talking about my soul here, a soul which, if you haven't noticed, we all share. I'd like not to painfully disintegrate when something happens with the hollow. Zangetsu furrowed his brow, and in the blink of an eye was once again in the teen's face. You got a problem with me being a hollow? You haven't been grateful for what I helped with so far. That pink-haired clown just jump-started the healing process. I alone did the rest. Ichigo took a moment to think before continuing his response. This hollow was obviously different than the ones he had encountered up to this point. Not once had this spirit tried to devour him. There was also the matter of the spirit being his Zanpakuto, so Ichigo theoretically couldn't be hurt by him. Ichigo glared at Zangetsu, his eyes burning a hole through the pale spirits. No, I don't have a problem, it's just a little weird to learn that my soul contains a hollow. Creatures which up to this point have been trying to kill me. But thank you, the teen tilted his head and gave a playful smile, for helping me. Zangetsu crossed his arms and turned away. No! We share the same soul, and we all die if you do. I was just looking out for me, that just so happens to start with keeping you alive. Ichigo took a step forward. Are you sure you weren't scared for me? He teased. Zangetsu had enough. Grabbing his hip, he searched for a blade that was not there. The spirit smirked. I don't need a blade to hurt you. He pointed while red ryatsu formed around the end of the digit, creating a zero. Ichigo's eyes widened at the new development, while the older spirit grabbed the younger's hand, forcing the zero blow up in the hollow's palm. Zangetsu cursed at the man as he yanked his burn arm away and took a few steps back. Tensa stepped forward. I apologize for his behavior. Hollows are creatures of instinct and can flip from peaceful to bloodthirsty very quickly. The same may happen once you begin using Zangetsu's hollow abilities. Ichigo glanced towards the pale spirit with unease. Wait, I'll begin to act like that? Pointing to Zangetsu, who had another zero in his hand. They both watched him release the red beam towards a nearby building, completely leveling it. In time and practice it will become manageable. The spirit took a long, deep breath and glanced at the cloudy sky above them. Ichigo, you may not realize it, but this is the first step towards a path of trouble and hardship. Difficult times will be ahead, and rain will surely fall once again. Just remember that as long as we are here, you will never fight alone. Tensa once again smiled at Ichigo. Ichigo hardly managed his own smile. Thank you, Tensa. I'll make sure not to forget. You too, Zangetsu, and thank you for healing me. Ichigo called to the further away spirit. The teen got a head nod from the older man, and the younger gave a huff before his vision dissolved to black. Before Ichigo's vision came back, the sound of both recognizable and unknown voices assaulted his ears. The tense voice of his father was the first one. I will ask you this one more time. Open this barrier before I break it. No can do Ishin. The Asachi is already glowing and he's talking to his Zanpakuto. Shinji made clear that the man wouldn't interfere. Shinji, why did you take Ichigo here instead of my shop? Tensai is much more proficient in healing. Then a couple of hours later try and give him his Zanpakuto. An unrecognizable and much more relaxed voice inquired. First, Ichigo was basically bleeding out on our doorstep. And after a little boost Ichigo healed himself, which leads us to the second point. We needed to know if it was a Quincy technique, or if he is one of the Vizards. A couple of loud huffs were heard around the blonde when he implicated the rest of the Vizards. A multitude of colors struck Ichigo's vision. He found himself exactly how his mind left him, sitting with the lightly glowing Asachi in his lap. His hands gripped at the hilt before unfolding his legs and silently rising to his feet. Ishin's and Shinji's verbal talk was on hold as they silently started a glaring contest. A black cat stepped in between the two idiots and in the blink of an eye, clawed both their feet, sending them to their knees. Hachi felt the slightest movement within the barrier and glanced in its direction, then quickly took it down and alerted the closest person, Kensei. Kensei slapped Shinji in the back of his head, breaking the blonde from his ongoing glaring contest. He's waking up. The blonde looked over at Ichigo, then walked over to the black-haired goat, slapped, and pointed in the teen's direction. Ichigo refocused his attention to the Asachi in his hand. A silent voice in the back of his mind telling him to pull with each hand. The blade then split in half down the middle and reformed in each of his hands, each side mirroring the other. The basic hilt was replaced by a black grip and a vibrant red diamond pattern. The rectangular guard shrank to become an oval, protecting his hand from the thin, bright silver blade. The blade's edge was as thin as possible, while the tip held the slightest of curves. One by one, each of the audience members held their breaths and comically began blinking rapidly, making sure they weren't hallucinating. Ichigo himself didn't even look up to see their faces, his eyes entranced by his own Zanpakuto until Tensa cut through his stunned mind. "Now call us forth, Ichigo." Despite never having been told the words, it didn't stop him from easily finding them. Like they had been engraved into his skin at birth and have been repeating them ever since. Shroud the realm in eternal twilight, Zangetsu. Visible Ryatsu quickly formed around the weapons, then dripped off their razor-sharpened edges, revealing dual darkened blades. Both lengthened slightly and had a much more noticeable curve. The guard turned black and now featured an opening with 4 sections, bridging the outer ring with the inner portion. The grip stayed the same while a thin white cloth fell from the pommel. For a moment nearly nothing happened. The stunned silence spoke more than anything Ichigo's audience could convey using words. The teens' Ryatsu prickled against their skin, setting off goosebumps and making them take a precautionary step back. The artificial light from the training ground's roof flickered and slowly dimmed. Only stopping once, the light level was that of a pink-skied sunset. Love silently removed his sunglasses. The combination of them with Ichigo's new ability made it nearly impossible for the man to see. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new Vizard." "That is not what I expected. If that's not a sign, I don't know what is." "Ichigo sure is interesting child. Of course, he has 2 ing blades, because why the hell not? Captain's going to love this." Outside the barrier, the cat's enhanced vision pierced through the shrouded area. It blinked multiple more times before trotting over to Urahara and clawed its way up the shopkeeper's back, creating blood stains on his clothing. The feline took its place on the man's shoulder. "Kisuke, I might be going crazy, or I fell on some of your laboratory drug needles, but is Ichigo holding more than one Zanpakuto?" It purred into the man's ear, then crawled its way to the other shoulder, getting a better look at the blades. He nodded. "I believe so, my dear Yorichi." The shopkeeper turned towards the silent, kneeling Isshin. The black-haired man hadn't moved. The feeling of Ichigo's Ryatsu was entirely different than before. His release mixed in certain elements, one being very clear to him. It was distant, almost non-existent, but that didn't stop the man from smiling. It felt like his late wife's own. Isshin's smile was a beacon of light for the shrouded area. "My son is a dual-wielder, my son a dual-wielder too, Zanpakuto. I can't wait to tell Shunsui and Jeshiro," he excitedly exclaimed, jumping to his feet before yelling out for everyone to hear. "That's my son, finally living up to the family greatness." Ichigo clutched at his head, careful not to stab himself over his father's loud ramblings. He watched with clear vision as his father rolled around on the ground next to the unknown people. More exiles, he assumed. Some glanced at Isshin while most kept their squinted eyes on his still form. "Heya Zangetsu, how do I turn this thing off?" Ichigo sheepishly asked his Zanpakuto, referring to the shrouded area around them. The response he got back wasn't very helpful. "Unbelievable, you really are useless. Just drop it." "Drop what exactly?" "I'm only holding on to my Zanpakuto, and I would prefer not dropping these as soon as I get them." "Not the Zanpakuto, you dumbass, drop your Ryatsu." When Ichigo tilted his head in confusion, Zangetsu continued to unhelpfully berate his wielder. "How are you this shit? I should have just let you." "He means for you pull in your Ryatsu. When you release your Zanpakuto, your Ryatsu rises and blankets the surrounding area." Tensa cut in. Ichigo responded with gratitude as he retracted his Ryatsu as much as he could, lifting the darkness and allowing everyone to see clearly. "Thank you, Tensa." A moment later, Ichigo received a mental growl. "Where's my thank you? I said the exact same thing. It's not my fault you're too dumb to understand." Ichigo snorted. "No, you didn't. What you said wasn't at all helpful, let alone possible to understand." Ichigo's face contorted and his ever-present scowl was deepening the longer this unintelligent argument went on. While he continued to argue with the spirit, the cloth hanging off the end of his Zanpakuto's pommel flowed with his Ryatsu, idly wrapping around the blade. Being lost in his argument, Ichigo didn't notice the approaching group. His father carefully stepped forward to see Ichigo's deeper than normal scowl, a clear sign that he was mentally communicating with his Zanpakuto. Normally it's not good to interrupt someone when they are communicating with their Zanpakuto, and it didn't help when Isshin lightly flicked some of his own Ryatsu at the occupied teen, knocking him off balance. Before Ichigo could recover, Isshin had pulled him into a crushing hug. You were talking to your Zanpakuto? What's his name? Or were you blessed like Kisuke over there and have a female Zanpakuto? Isshin squealed, looking down at his son and wiggling his eyebrows. Ichigo squirmed in his father's grip. He was getting close to freedom before being pulled back in. The teen then elbowed his father, knocking the wind out of the older man, then escaping from the intrusive hug. He's Zangetsu. Ichigo paused when his father gave a high-pitched gasp. And one of them is a hollow. Ichigo smirked when Isshin became pale. You wouldn't happen to know why, would you? The Vizards not too far away celebrated by swatting at each other. Shinji, on the other hand, was much more daring. A pharaoh hollow mask over his face, and a small Siro at his fingertips. The subsequent blast at the ceiling created a fun new game, dodging the falling debris. When the blonde had a second Siro in his hand, Hiyori was already in his face, sandal mid-swing. Smack! The onlookers could only wince at the sound when the sandal connected with Shinji's face and the man hit the ground, hard. You stupid jackass, why'd you do that? Without waiting for an answer, she struck again. Smack! And one more for good measure. Smack! Shinji slowly curled into a fetal position before looking death in her brown eyes. Celebratory Siro? Smack! The captain of Squad 8, Shunsui Kairaka, was once again over at the 13th Division visiting his longtime friend and captain, Jushiro Yukitake. He visited almost daily, avoiding the tedious amount of paperwork, often handing his share to his lieutenant, Nanao IC, and any seated officer that was close by. The vibrant pink and flower-patterned kimono wearing captain laid spread out on the large couch in Yukitake's office. His straw hat on his chest and a half-drunken glass of sake in his hand. A bottle of the same liquid was placed on the table situated between two couches. Yukitake sat behind his desk mindlessly signing his name on every paper that passed. The friendly captain's white hair rolled off his shoulders when he signed another paper and placed it on top of the complete stack situated in the corner of his desk. Personally, he didn't mind this aspect of being a captain, unlike his friend in the room. Kairaka sighed for what felt like the 100th time. Swirling his drink, the flamboyant man glanced upwards to check if his companion had finally stopped working. He frowned when Yukitake ignored it and grabbed another paper, so he did the only logical thing and dramatically sighed again. Yukitake didn't need to ask what was wrong, he already knew. Everyone already knew, but he'd humor the man anyways. He glanced at the time when carefully setting his brush down. Is there something on your mind, Shunsui? Have you chosen who will be your lieutenant yet? The relaxed captain questioned. Yukitake raised an eyebrow. He was expecting a far different question. I have, but depending on how this evening goes, I may have to continue my search. Kairaka emptied his glass of sake before stretching over and grabbing the bottle, then pouring until his glass was nearly full. He may drink often, but right now he could tell that shit was about to hit the fan. This whole thing with Rukia couldn't be happening at a worse time. The white-haired captain gave a nod, silently agreeing. Everyone needs to have a clear mind before the Central 46 meeting, and this transferring powers to a human boy will only give the divisions something to pick sides over. Yukitake gave a quick laugh. And you drinking can't possibly be helping, he joked, getting up from his desk and crossing the room to another couch opposite the drinking man. Said man chuckled, then pulled a second and used glass, and poured the remaining sake into it. Hey, I've yet to meet a problem that drinking can't solve. Relationships, hard work, and clear thinking, sake can do it all. Perhaps you should be handing it out to every division. Unfortunately, I don't have that much sake. Yukitake raised an accusing eyebrow. Not within the Suriidii. Besides, it's hard enough to sneak past my lovely Nanao normally, and even worse now that her friend is on trial. Yukitake stared at the filled glass in front of him. Let's hope that Central 46 can make the right decision for once. If not, I might actually drink this, he solemnly said, raising the glass in a small toast. Kairaka followed. I know what I'm hoping for, he said, lightly clinking their glasses as two hell butterflies flew through an open window behind the desk. They fluttered together, then split off towards each captain, landing on their outstretched finger. All captains are to report to the Central 46 compound for the scheduled meeting and subsequent trials. The voice of Captain Commander Yamamoto came through before the winged creatures flew back out the window. Yukitake set down his untouched glass when Kairaka sat up and in one gulp drank the remaining sake within his glass. Well, better get this over with, Jushiro, he said, picking up Yukitake's undrinked glass and downing it in one move. Then standing up, he placed his signature hat on and shook out his numb limbs. He walked to the door, slid it open and passed through like he owned the place. After hundreds of years of visiting this division, he could walk back to his own blindfolded if he wanted to. Once exiting the office, he shifted to let his friend properly walk beside him. They opted to walk instead of flash step. They weren't in an immediate rush and wanted to enjoy the peaceful, slow pace. While they walked past, members of both the 8th and 13th each gave their respective captains a short bow. Unlike many of the other divisions, the 8th and 13th worked hand in hand. Their captains had always spent so much time together, their respective divisions had intertwined. If one was in trouble, the other would be there in a heartbeat. They took their time reaching the Central 46 compound, enjoying the pink-colored sunset sky and each other's company. Passing the guards and entering a small building, they walked down brightly lit stairs. They entered a long hallway. The doors at the end were wide open, revealing a large round chamber, a couple of chairs in the middle and 13 more placed further away. Above sat 2 levels of 46 seats, a plaque in front of each with their own number. Both split off and took their seats marked by their division number. Multiple other captains already sat in their own seats. Captain Commander and Captain of Squad 1, Yamamoto. An old frail-looking man with a long white beard, a giant faded scar over his forehead, and a cane in hand. Other captains along with him sat in their numbered seats. Squad 4's Retsu Unhana, Squad 5 Sosuke Aizen, Squad 6 Byakuya Kachiki, Squad 7's Sajin Kamamura, Squad 9's Kaname Tozen, Squad 10's Toshiro Hitsugaya, and Squad 12's Mayuri Kuratsuchi. A few minutes passed of idle chatter from the members above them while they waited for the remaining captains. Captain of Squad 2 Soifan walked through the open door with a disgusted face. Behind her was a pink-haired girl and Lieutenant of Squad 11 Yichiro Kusujishi. She was here in place of her captain, who would end up stabbing everyone in proximity. Even further behind them was Captain of Squad 3 Jinikimaru, his ever-present grin plastered on his face when taking his seat and looking between everyone present. With all captains there, the doors finally closed when the sound of a gavel echoed through the chamber. Now that all of the division's representatives have arrived, we may begin our meeting, the speaker said. The next hour, as always for a normal Central 46 meeting, was one of the most boring things each captain could go through. All captains other than the 11th had to attend these pointless meetings. Nothing happened, new laws were proposed, and old ones disputed. Each member continued to argue their point, and by the end nothing had changed. By this time most captains were slouching, some on the edge of sleep, while the 1st, 4th, and 5th captains sat perfectly straight. The heavy gavel struck once again, causing all slouching captains to sit at attention. It's time we move on to the trials. The accused prisoners will be read their charges, then plead their case. After all prisoners plead, an anonymous vote will commence. At the end, each prisoner will be given their freedom or sentence. The doors swung open and multiple guards flanked a dozen beaten soul reapers shackled together by their feet, their arms constricted to their chests, and a ryatsu blocking collar around their necks. The captain of Squad 10 sat straighter than anyone else, an impassive look on his face, but below his facade was a young man who at this time wanted nothing more than to brutally slaughter each chained soul reaper at the center of the chamber. The concealed speaker's voice spoke again, reading from a paper in his hands. 11th Division Patrol Squad 16, you stand accused of breaking your designated patrol route, sneaking into the 10th Division and ambushing 10th Division Patrol Squad 22, maiming and killing all but 2 members. The captain stayed silent as the room broke out into murmurs before the gavel hit again, silencing them. Squad 10's Lieutenant Ranjiku Matsumoto has claimed witness to the fight and stopped it without further bloodshed. How do you plead? Chains rattled as their group leader moved to the forefront, then spitting out, not guilty. Your plea is noted and will be discussed further. The doors behind the group opened and the guards silently led the chained accused through it. Bring forth the next prisoner. Rukia made her way to the center of the chamber, her resolve growing with every step until her gaze found Byakuya's. His impassive noble mask displayed a flicker of uncertainty. Rukia Kachiki, you stand accused of interacting with humans, giving your powers to a human boy, teaching said boy basic Soul Reaper knowledge, and attacking a lieutenant when being placed into custody. We have strict laws. Under no circumstance can the dead and the living interact, yet you pranced around for months like you were one of them. You are sister to the Kuchiki clan head. As such you set an example to the peasants not only within the Rukangai but the Suriidai. The speaker took a moment to catch his breath, then finished. Rukia Kuchiki, how do you plead? As the speaker read out the charges against her, Rukia's mind raced. The realization of how many charges there were and that they were right, she had pretended to be human, made her hesitate for a long moment when given the chance to plead. Do I not get to explain why I had to give them over? She finally mustered the courage to ask. Why doesn't matter when you are guilty? The speaker responded with disdain. Rukia bit her lip, unable to change their minds. As the gavel struck, she was led away, chains clinking with each step, echoing through the chamber. The chamber erupted in noise, each talking to one another and casting their individual votes. Yukite glanced at Byakuya, who had his hands in his lap, the impassive and cold face in full effect. But what caught the older man's eye was the minuscule fidget of Byakuya's fingers. Yukite's next glance was towards Kairaku, who looked to be bracing himself for the worst-case scenario. After a while the chatter slowly ceased, votes for each trial anonymously cast. The guards opened the chamber doors and in walked the group of accused Soul Reapers. The gavel struck. The witness, Lieutenant Matsumoto, has been deemed uncredible. Hitsugaya's eyes widened. She has a reputation of drinking while on the job and is highly likely that she was intoxicated during the events. Because of that, her report and all evidence that revolves around her are now disregarded. Hitsugaya flung to his feet, biting his tongue to make sure he didn't yell. I disagree. Whether or not my lieutenant was drinking doesn't take away the fact my squad was brutally killed. Unfortunately, Captain Hitsugaya, the evidence brought forth all comes from an intoxicated Soul Reaper, therefore none of the evidence gathered is usable. A vote has taken place, and as of right now 11th Division Patrol Squad 16 is set free. Unchain them. The guards moved with efficiency, removing each of their collars and unchaining their limbs. Many of the chamber's occupants began to shiver when slick ice formed on the walls, a cause of Hitsugaya's barely contained rage. The short captain bit his lip when the newly unchained Soul Reaper smirked his way, blood freely dripping down his chin as he switched to grinding his teeth. Every ounce of self-restraint was used to not decapitate them where they stood. Furthermore, Lieutenant Matsumoto is under arrest for falsely claiming treason and contaminating evidence. Anyone who aids her will be punished alongside her. That set Hitsugaya off. In one flash step he traveled across the room and out the door. If he stayed any longer, he would have ended up killing every member of Central 46 where they sat. A trail of frozen tiles was left in his wake. Yukitake lowered his head. Things weren't going well so far, and unfortunately, they were not going to get better. Ah, Shiro's leaving us. Should you be talking, Jin? You're blind, Tozen. You don't know the color of my hair. Yamamoto tapped his cane on the ground to get the 3rd and 9th captains to stop talking as the group of formerly accused Soul Reapers exited the doors and Rukia was pushed back in. Taking her place in the center, she looked up at the plaques obscuring the members of Central 46. Biting the inside of her cheek, she listened as the speaker took his place. Rukia Kuchiki, you are guilty of our strictest laws. Of course, these crimes have happened before, but we cannot let them happen again. We will make you our example of the punishment given to those who break it. Rukia Kuchiki, by the rule of Central 46 you are sentenced to death by the Sokaiku and your soul removed from the cycle of reincarnation. Your execution is set for the turn of the month, scheduled to change if anyone attempts to impede justice. Rukia's legs went numb. She would have yelled and screamed in that moment, kicked at the guards when they began to drag her back to her cell in the 6th Division, bit at them when they got too close, but when she opened her mouth, nothing happened. With the shove of an impatient guard, she stumbled out of the chamber. Byakuya sat there, watching his sister's departure in silence, his emotions hidden but betrayed by the subtle tremor of his fingers. The other captains exchanged uneasy glances, a collective shock settling in. Each captain's ryatsu rose to silently battle against Byakuya's. Without a word the noble followed his condemned sister out the chamber. Yukitake buried his face in his hands for a moment before rising and carefully walking over the ice trail through the door with Kairaku right behind him. Silently, Every captain and member of Central 46 rose from their seats one by one, exiting the chamber and leaving only 2 figures in the dimly lit room. Jin stood in the doorway near the exit, staring back at an unmoved figure. Captain, was killing those Soul Reapers really necessary? A moment of silence passed before the figure in the dark spoke. I didn't kill anyone, Jin. I just stoked the flames that have naturally ignited. And Kuchiki's sister? Kasuke Urahara believes I need his Hogyoku that's inside the young Kuchiki. The bespectacled captain calmly walked past Jin and into the hallway, not stopping to add. Urahara will arrive and unknowingly be pouring oil all over the flames of the Suriidai. Jin shook his head and followed the man out. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the PancakeBatterBTW for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. If you like to hear adult version of this and other stories, I'll give you link of my Patreon. See you in the next video. Goodbye.